This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
Hi, it's William B. Davis. I play the smoking man on The X-Files, and you're listening to the X-Cast.
Welcome back, everybody, to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I am your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you very much for joining me for this episode all about episode 11 of season 6 of the X-Files, which is Two Fathers. And joining me for the first time in season 6 is Darren Mooney. Hi, Darren.
Hey, how's it going? How are things?
Things are okay, and it's very nice to have you back because, you know, traditionally we'd speak to you. Normally Tony would speak to you on the season openers.
Well, this year was a special year, both for the show and for the show that you're discussing on the show, which I quite like in terms of metafiction. I like that the X-Cast had its own movement to California, so to speak.
Yeah, well, big thanks to the We Made This network for relocating me. No, it's good to have you back, though, and it's good to talk to you for this one, which is, like I said, Two Fathers, written by Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz, directed by Kim Manners, first broadcast on February the 7th, 1999. I think, Darren, just before we do delve into this episode, as I say, it's the first time we've spoken to you this season. What are your general thoughts on the first chunk of season 6 then? You know, up to this episode. You know, X-Files Light, some people call it, but, you know, Drive, Triangle, How to Go Steal Christmas, etc., etc. Fond of that stretch of the show?
I'm very fond of that stretch of the show. I mean, I would argue that taken back to back, Drive and Triangle is the best 2-episode run in the show's entire history, which is quite saying something. I am very partial to the whole X-Files Light era. Even the episodes that don't necessarily work perfectly in that kind of have a sense, like Dreamland, for example, have a sense of fun and wonder and adventure to them, which marks them out very distinctly from what came before. And I know that there's a reaction to them precisely for that reason, in that I know that a lot of people who were tuning in for the 6th season of the X-Files wanted the show to be as it had been the previous 5 seasons. But I think it's a lot smarter to recognize that with the move to Los Angeles in terms of production, you were not going to be able to replicate what you got in Vancouver, at least not straight away. You were working under a different set of constraints. And what I like about the X-Files Light era of the show is that rather than trying to conceal that or bury it or pretend that it's not happening, it actively leans into it. And it leans into it, obviously, with more scenes taking place during the day, obviously with more scenes taking place in the desert, which was famously the one thing they couldn't do in Vancouver unless they painted an entire quarry red.
And from the first shot of the first episode of season 6.
Yeah, as well. Like with the sun, just to let you know that you are literally in a different country. Even things like the casting there, where the guest cast, you know, the previous 5 seasons had used these Vancouver character actors or actors from Los Angeles that they could conveniently fly up to Vancouver for a week or two at a time. Like with the start of the 6th season moving in LA, it's like, no, we're moving in circles. We can now bring in Ed Asner and Lily Tomlin, for example, or we can bring in Bruce Campbell and have him hang out with the cast. And I like that the show doesn't try to conceal that or write around it. I like the 8th season where they where they manage to do something dark and gritty and kind of like seedy and atmospheric in Los Angeles, but I don't think they could have done it right away. I think it would have been too jarring, and I think it would have been unconvincing. And in fact, I would actually argue, not to jump too far ahead in the discussion, but I think that the second half of the 6th season is much, much, much weaker than the first, because it doesn't have that luxury of, well, we're doing something unusual for the show, we're doing something new or interesting. It settles down into trying to do regular X-Files stuff, and the show, and again, you know, not to jump too far ahead, not to damn the show or unfairly condemn it, the show is not in a place where it can do traditional X-Files stuff anymore as easily as it used to. The creaks are beginning to show. So you start seeing episodes like Alpha, for example, which is just kind of, you know, just lifeless, empty, and kind of dull, as opposed to at least in the first half, it's chaotic and fun and interesting. So I'm a huge fan of the X-Files Light era. I really, really like that stretch at the start of the season.
And then we get to the mid-season point where they're starting to do stuff like SR819, Tivernus, and now this two-parter, which effectively is an attempt to turn the page. And it's often referred to as the end of a chapter and that kind of thing. I'm sure we'll discuss over these next 2 episodes the extent to which this is actual change and...
Or the illusion of change in the Stan Lee parlance.
All of this stuff, yeah. In broad terms, though, because obviously we'll come on to the Syndicate being incinerated and so on. But what about that decision in general terms to turn the page? You can understand it, I think, after the way the mythology had developed and so on.
Well, I mean, when they talk about this, and particularly say on the recent commentary on the Blu-ray editions, Frank Spotnitz revisits it, but throughout the press, both for the episode itself, Carter talking to the Television Critics Association, discussions after the end of the show, there's a real sense when you listen to Carter and Spotnitz talk about this episode, it's not a sense of necessarily wanting to do this or feeling like this is the next logical step for the show to develop. It's more like a bit of necessary housekeeping. And it feels quite appropriate that it happens directly after the movie, which is arguably the biggest that the X-Files has ever been in terms of like pop culture. It's a summer blockbuster based on the X-Files. It's as broad an audience as possible. And there's a sense when you listen to Carter and Spotnitz talk about Two Fathers, One Son, there's a sense of realizing coming out of the movie, well, oh my god, this is not necessarily as accessible as a popular 4-quadrant blockbuster television show needs to be anymore. It's gained a lot of kind of weight and a lot of mythology and a lot of threads, a lot of story arc elements that we basically need to unload in order to let the car drive a bit faster. So it really feels more like a bit of housekeeping. And it's, that kind of sense when you're doing housekeeping of, well, I have to do housekeeping because I want the house to be tidy, but the process of doing it isn't necessarily enjoyable of itself.
Yeah.
And there's a real kind of sense of that watching Two Fathers, One Son. And not to cramp on the two-parter too much, because there are parts of this that I love and adore, parts of it that I think are absolutely brilliant and fantastic and bold and ambitious and interesting. But watching it, and particularly watching it from a vantage point of the show having been over for a very long time, and having watched in the context of like rewatching the show to talk about it on this podcast, there is a real sense of, well, is this really accomplishing what it's setting out to do? And there are points where it feels almost like a shopping list more than, an actual episode of television or a 2-part episode of television, I think.
Because it's kind of oddly placed, isn't it? You say it feels appropriate after the movie, but it also feels like this would have been an appropriate kind of story to attempt for a film, or an appropriate kind of story to attempt for like a series finale or something, doesn't it? So It's kind of curious mid-season 6, isn't it? In some ways. And maybe that's part of the appeal.
I think that, like, okay, well, I think there's no way that you could do this for the movie, to be absolutely clear. There is no way
logistically.
Not logistically, just even in terms of making it appealing to an audience. Like, I mean, I am very invested in these characters. Like, I care about the second elder when whatever happens to him in this 2-parter. But that's because I've watched the show religiously, and I really like that character. Asking an audience coming to the cinema to sit down and to pay attention to all these lectures where the cigarette smoking man lays out in great deal of depth for 45 minutes the mechanics of what's happening and spells it all out. And then you watch these characters who, had a long history on the show, admittedly, many of whom didn't actually appear in the film, but like basically reached the end of their arcs, isn't something that I think you could sell as a blockbuster to a summer audience, to a summer movie audience. I think this is something that has to be for fans who have watched the show kind of, not from day one necessarily, but who have got caught up with it as it's going. I think Spotnitz, again, he did a recent commentary for it, like retrospectively on the Blu-rays, and he was observing, like, even rewatching the episode years after finishing working on the show, it's like, this is really dense. This is really alienating. Yeah. If you have no attachment to who these characters are coming into it, this episode, this story isn't going to give you that attachment. Instead, it plays off it and kind of develops it. So I think that that's the reason why this could never work as a summer blockbuster movie, at least in its current form.
That's the point, I think, yeah. That was just the idea of an invasion is kind of what I meant, it feels like the big canvas,
It does, yeah, the idea, you could probably do the idea of invasion, but then again, you would have to strip out the stuff that I would argue, and I know that we've done the Fight the Future Minute, and we've had that discussion countless times, but I think that in order to fit this stuff in, you would have to take out the stuff that mainstream audiences reacted to in Fight the Future, which is Mulder and Scully in love, the cock-blocking bee and stuff like that. And like those elements, and like Mulder getting drunk and stuff like that, which would take up narrative space. The appearance of kind of, the character, what's the name? I've already forgotten it. Damn it. His father's, his father's, the guy who worked with his father on the project, played by Martin
Kurzweil?
Landau, Kurzweil, stuff like that. You'd have to take all that stuff out in order to cram in the alien invasion stuff. And you'd also end up, like, competing with ID4, which is not necessarily something that I think Fight the Future could do, even with the budget that Fox was allowing it. And in terms of season finale, I suspect I know why it wasn't a season finale. And that is probably because you don't want your season finale in a long-running show that is going to have at least a 7th season to feel like an ending. You don't want your audience to walk away from what you know at this point is not going to be the final season. Carter knew that the 7th season might be the final season, but he knew this one wasn't going to be. You don't want the audience to turn off at the end of the 6th season and go, well, that's it. I got everything I wanted. All my answers are here. This conspiracy is at least close to wrapped up. I don't really feel any obligation to come back next season. And indeed, you could argue that that is one of the problems with the 9th season, where the 8th season has this really beautiful, like, closing two-parter that, you know, whether or not you like it, it draws together many of the threads that have run through the show and the season and wraps a bow around them. And then the 9th season happens. And Carter pointed out, nobody turned up to watch it. And again, that's something to talk about when we get there, but I suspect one of the reasons was a lot of people got what they wanted from the X-Files out of the 8th season finale, so there was no reason to come back. And I suspect that's maybe why you didn't want Two Fathers, One Son to be a season finale, because you don't want an audience that has been, like, watching this and, like, pressing for answers and wanting to follow this conspiracy plot thread to go, well, that's it, done, guess I'm out.
Yeah, well, or a series finale is what I meant, but even there, when he gets to season 9 and he knows it's the end of the series, he doesn't know if it's the end of the narrative because it's the intention to go to films, etc., etc. Okay, what about overall on Two Fathers then? Now, I am going to venture a 7 out of 10. How about you?
I'd probably go with a 6 out of 10, but yeah, so we're not too far off one another, I think.
Yeah, now it's nice because it's nice for me to have a season 6 episode to discuss that I do like, because the past two that I've done, I've kind of been a bit more lukewarm on. However, I do only like it. I don't love this episode. I think it's curious in some ways. There's a lot of exposition, and there's, you know, we'll talk about how Mulder and Scully factor into this and so on. And I'm not sure everything works, but I do find it interesting. I do enjoy seeing the ensemble that's been amassed here. I do enjoy seeing them do their stuff. And I think as the episode wears on, there's some promise in the back part of the episode, which, you know, holds out the potential for a stronger second half. What are your overall thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot, again, this is one of the things where it's a very much a mixed bag, and it's almost like while Two Fathers and One Son are very different episodes, they have kind of the same dynamic or relationship to them, which is that you have a subplot running through them, which is very interesting. And in Two Fathers in particular, it's the stuff involving Jeffrey Spender, which is absolutely fascinating and compelling and engaging in its own terms. And then you have the other stuff happening, which is the big important stuff, which involves, you know, the cigarette smoking man literally narrating the conspiracy to, well, we later find out that it's Foley, but like for the purposes of this episode, to the audience sitting at home who are tuning in, because again, this was sold. This was Two Fathers was very much sold by the network as, well, you've wanted answers for 5 years and we're about to give them to you. I think that it managed to, it was like advertisements were taken out in newspapers selling this two-parter, which is part of the February sweeps, as the X-Files finally telling you what it was going to happen. 5 years of questions, 2 nights of answers is how it was sold. Carter did a press tour with the Television Critics Association, and I think that it was regarded as one of the success stories. People actually tuned in. 11 million households and 18 million people watched Two Fathers, which is, by the way, in terms of mapping the X-Files kind of like arc in popular consciousness, it's worth noting that while this was the second highest rated episode of the season, behind The Rain King, the X-Files would never be watched by as many people again. You could make a solid argument that this was the, you know, one of the marks on the downward trend of the X-Files as a central cultural institution towards the end of the 1990s. And I mean, there are some other ones that will probably pass on the 6th and 7th season, but that's the kind of one that jumps out at me. And I think, like, that aspect of the episode is a lot weaker. The part that's like, okay, we gotta actually wrap this up, and we gotta wrap it up in a way that ensures that the audience won't be unnecessarily confused, or will be confused as little as possible watching this. So we're going to give them Mulder and Scully, even though arguably I would suggest, perhaps boldly, that Two Fathers and One Son would be a much stronger episode if you took Mulder and Scully out or at least marginalize them even more than they are. Because at the moment, there's a weird, like, 1 foot, 2 foot in thing that we'll probably talk about later, where it's like, it's kind of not a Mulder and Scully episode, but Mulder and Scully are kind of there because they have to be. And again, with the narration, with the cigarette smoking man, which is very much, if you're an audience member tuning into the X-Files for the first time, well, you picked a hell of a night to do it. But also, like, he spells out everything in a very precise, very literal expository sort of way, but it has no real emotional content. The emotional content of the episode is all with Spender and his mother, and that's where the heart lies. And like Two Fathers, and you know, and it'll be another issue in One Son with two other elements, but in the context of Two Fathers, that's the kind of the sense in which the episode is caught between two extremes. There's the very intimate psycho family drama involving the Spender family, which is great and is arguably like gets at the heart thematically of the conspiracy and the mythology. And then there's the event episode that has to be constructed around it, coming off the back of a blockbuster summer movie in the hopes that an audience that opened up TV Guide and were promised that the X-Files would finally be explained to them are going to get all the answers that they need. And I think that for me is the kind of big divide within the episode, what works and what doesn't.
There's also a divide, isn't there, between, you know, these big events, you know, which are meant to be revelatory and seismic and so on. And most of it takes place in interior settings, whereas we're accustomed to a big sweep in these mythology installments, aren't we? You know, I think of 731 or The Red and the Black or Paperclip, you know, where there's lots going on, lots of location hopping and so on.
Here we have a hangar. We have an airplane hangar. And like, to be fair, like Spotnitz and Manners on their commentaries both single it out. It's like, it's a great location. It's like, yes, it is a great location, but it is also an airplane hangar. And like, my favorite little detail about the airplane hangar is that it's used in both episodes and it's used in both flashbacks to 1973 and the present. And apparently between 1973 and the present day, nobody has moved the fire truck out of the middle of it. Apparently, like, nobody has, like, tidied the hangar in any way or moved any of the vehicles in any way. It is exactly the same as it was 25 years ago at this point, yes. Which I find actually quite hilarious. But yeah, you're right. It's all interiors, it's all familiar sets, it's all standing sets. And again, there's that sense of the move to Los Angeles. And I think actually, to be fair to Spotnitz, he admits this himself on the commentary. Yeah. He says that the budget simply did not go as far in Los Angeles. I mean, there are stories about when they're doing like location scouting on the 6th season, literally because of traffic, not being able to go as far as they could in Vancouver. And so not being able to get locations, and that then trickles down. And when you have like delays in getting to set, that means you have less time to film. You can only go so far outside the catchment area. And so your options are limited. And I think you do. I think you're right. You do see that here compared to even say Colony and Endgame. Like, remember the ambition of Colony and Endgame, where, like, I think Spotnitz said, we wrote in a submarine breaking the ice because we didn't know that wasn't something a TV show could do. And then they did it. There's nothing in Two Fathers, One Son that matches that in terms of just cinematic spectacle. And that's despite the best effort of Kim Manners and Rob Bowman, who do as good a job as they can, I think, with the material they're given.
Let's pick up some of this as we go along. But just before we dive into the episode in more detail, IMDb, Darren, what do you reckon out of 10? What do you reckon?
Okay, well, keep in mind now, normally I have a bit of an advantage in that I've been around a bit, so I get a sense of how the season is generally rated. So I'm going to pluck a number out of thin air. I think it's a mythology episode, so it's going to be rated highly, because those are always rated highly. I think that history has probably been kinder to this, given that, like, the truth is this, but worse. Far, far worse. And the fact that, like, this is at least nominally and in appearance an ending, as opposed to what happened when the show came back and Carter was like, yeah, what are endings? I don't even know what endings are. So I'm going to say this got a high rating. I'm going to say a 7.8.
I'll tell you what, listeners, he's been away half a season, and I'm afraid he's missing a step here. It's 8.8, Darren.
Damn it!
8.8 out of 10. Which puts it 5th for the season on IMDb when you line them up top to bottom. It's equal with Triangle, I can tell you that, on IMDb ratings. What kind of episodes? What? Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Wow.
What sort of episodes do you think might have come in the top 4 above this?
Okay, so it has been a while since I watched the season. I'm going to take a punt. I'm going to say that, like, One Son is probably higher than this.
Yes. Yep.
Because it's a conclusion, and so if you like the lead up, you're going to like the conclusion. In terms of, I'm going to say, okay, fine, swinging a hit. Let's go with Drive. Drive is higher.
Afraid not.
What?
Sorry.
Okay, that's grand. Okay, Drive is not higher. Let's go with okay. Let's just get my game face on, Darren. You can do this. All right. So in terms of Monday, is Monday higher?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool. That's grand. All right. Finales are always high. I'm gonna go with Biogenesis.
It's actually the Dreamland two-parter are the remaining episodes. I believe the first Dreamland was, at the time of recording, the highest rated of the season. Which surprised me. Top 5 for this one surprised me, I've got to say.
Wow.
But for all the reasons you outline, mythology's popular and so on, maybe it does make a bit of sense.
Yeah, wow. I would have figured Dreamland wouldn't be high. Dreamland 2 being high is a surprise.
You don't think that people who like the first one are more than likely to like the second one? No?
I think that, like, Dreamland is one of the rare X-Files two-parters where there is a very noticeable drop-off between the two parts. And particularly the ending. It's one of those episodes where I think the ending, or expected the ending, would sour people on it, possibly. But what do I know? I clearly know nothing about the IMDb, apparently.
Well, there's a slight drop-off because Dreamland, I think, was rated a notch higher, but only a touch.
Only a notch.
Okay, Darren, let's dive in and take a closer look at Two Fathers. Okay, Darren, so we'll try and go through the main points. We might skip the odd scene here or there, but just, if I do skip anything you want to talk about, just stop me. The teaser then, which is all about, the operation on Cassandra Spender, who returns. Dr. Openshaw's work is apparently completed, but then the other doctors are torched outside, the Faceless Rebels are back, and so on. So this teaser, I guess it features, as does subsequent scenes in the episode, some familiar iconography from the myth arc. These trains, the green blood, the faceless aliens.
The Roche van, yeah.
Yep. And a familiar returning character in Cassandra. So all suitable stuff, I suppose.
Yeah, there's very much like, okay, well, all the stuff that you like is here, and we're not going to add any more. Which really, again, it really feels like the show is kind of like putting its hands up and saying, okay. Because I think that one of the things that's quite striking about the show is it always seems to want to add more. Carter always looks at, like, the Jenga tower that he's built, and he's like, I can put another block on top. I think, like, the Red and the Black and Patient X are my favorite example of that, because it's like, okay, sure, we're ramping up for the movie. We've already filmed the movie. I know who's in the movie, but I really want to add this character, these two characters, Cassandra and Jeffrey Spender, to the narrative, so they're in there. And I know that we didn't have Faceless Rebels in the movie, but they're in this episode too. And that opening scene of Two Fathers really just feels like the show saying, okay, pinky swear, promise, we are not going to add anything more. We're just going to take what we already have and try to smooth it out as much as possible. That's it. So, it does feel very much like a kind of a promise to the audience in that regard.
Which is also relevant, I think, to the framing device we get in a moment. Just quickly on the teaser, actually, I think Kim Manners on the commentary says that these people who played the Faceless Rebels had to be stuntmen because it was very easy for them to fall over. So it had to be people who knew how to take a fall.
Imagine they're a liability nightmare when you sew an actor's eyes shut and just ask them to wander around a set. I think most directors would joke they have enough trouble hitting their marks already. Sorry.
What Kim Manners also says is that the original script had several flashback sequences. So Peter Donat, William B. Davis, Veronica Cartwright, back in the 1970s. And he says this, when they tried it, it just didn't quite work out. So I'm imagining that, considering that the framing device of the smoking man is basically just him speaking to somebody off screen who we see right at the very end, I'm imagining this is what they replaced it with. He gives quite an interesting speech, doesn't he? It's quite knowing. There's some dialogue here where it seems like, it's kind of Chris Carter speaking through cigarette smoking man. I could never have scripted all this, and that kind of thing.
No, it's very much like Chris Carter. I'm not being particularly kind of subtle stuff going on here as well, because there is a real sense, and again, the reason that they give for ending the mythology here, or like making the decision that they do with the mythology here, which is go for kind of a tabula rasa approach at the end of it, makes sense. It's organic and it's reasonable, and it's if you're mapping out a show, it's a sane thing for you to do as a creative. But there's also a sense, having watched the show, that Carter maybe didn't necessarily exactly want to do it this way. And while he may have understood or been told or kind of like negotiated with everybody else and determined this was the best outcome, there's also a bit of anxiety around it. Because, I mean, one of the big recurring central motifs of Two Fathers is this discussion about, well, it's a terrible thing for a man to see his children die before he does, or to see his children end before his time. Yeah. When again, like, Carter's used that imagery before. I mean, postmodern Prometheus is very much along the lines of treating a child, in that case the Great Mutato, as a metaphor for the show. This thing that Carter created that took on a life of itself and became this weird monstrosity of like different elements and influences, and kind of became hugely popular and fun and crazy in ways that he could never have imagined. And I think that, you know, you can see in Two Fathers, One Son, you know, arguably the son in question isn't Fox Mulder, it isn't Krycek, it isn't Spender, it is the show itself. It's this idea of kind of Carter as a father or a writer or a parent figure saying, well, you know, this isn't necessarily how I would have done it or how I wanted to do it or how I expected to do it. Because the cigarette smoking man's monologue is, you put your life into something, you build it and protect it, and then it all just burns down. And it's like, I feel like there's some subtext there. Like, I feel like this, you know, it's maybe communicating something to us about how the show feels about doing what it's about to do.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a weird combination, his monologue of, because he goes into, we had a perfect conspiracy with an alien race and all that stuff. So it's this weird thing where, you know, some clever stuff and some very artless dialogue too, I think. I don't know if you felt that way.
Oh, there's plenty of artless dialogue. Like, I mean, like, this is one of the things. Two Fathers does that thing that becomes a bigger issue with the X-Files later on, and particularly in the 8th season. And I say this loving the 8th season. But if you go back and you watch the show, and you watch the early seasons, and particularly the mythology episodes of the early seasons, one of the things that people complain about most frequently is that it's too abstract, it's too vague. The characters are never specific about what they're talking about. And they use lots of abstract nouns. It's like, oh, the project must proceed. Colonization is planned. The date has been set. And they use all these proper, very archetypal kind of words. And they do that, and like, a big problem watching the X-Files for a lot of fans was, yeah, but they're not telling us anything. They're not laying out the details or the mechanics of this. And watching the show, particularly in hindsight, knowing where it goes, you begin to understand that that was not a flaw, that was not a bug, that was a feature, because when you do start laying out specifics, when you start spelling out and actually using descriptive nouns instead of the plan, it's the colonization attempt with an alien race to infect and subjugate humanity by creating a race of slave clones. That immediately sounds more alienating and more strange and like something that no human being would ever utter convincingly. And so it becomes distracting. And there are whole scenes of that in Two Fathers and One Son. Like, there's a moment later on where Cassandra literally just says, oh no, the aliens are going to come and they're going to replace us and they're going to wipe us out and enslave us, and this was a deal that was made. And it's all very much like, in case you didn't get what they were talking about when they talked about colonization and the project and the plan and the date. This is it in plain English. And when you put it in plain English, it sounds really, really stupid. And it becomes a problem in the 8th season where you have things like super soldiers. And it's like, I get what you're doing, but super soldiers is never going to sound like a convincing, like, threat.
Credible.
I'm never going to believe this conspiracy theory that involves a word that I typically associate with Captain America.
Well, I think there are some choice quotes we can pull out as we go along. But yeah, I agree. So we get Spender and Skinner, of course. I quite like that little scene with them because it's almost like an iteration of the kind of thing we'd get with Mulder sometimes in like a series finale where Skinner would come and check on him like in the end or something, you know. Here it's to tell Spender about Cassandra's abduction. Given where this is going with Spender, do you think we've seen enough of him in the series up to this point for everything that comes later to be especially meaningful to the audience?
No, I think that's one of the big problems with the sixth season, the episode as a whole, is that Spender, and again, I'm going to just lay my cards on the table and say I'm a big fan of Spender as a concept. I think Chris Owens is great as an actor, and I think the character concept of Spender is absolutely amazing. But I also think the character is severely underutilized. And most notably because outside of a small appearance in terms of endearment in the teaser, he only appears in mythology episodes. And it's worth noting that, like, the best characters, the characters who become the most well-rounded characters in the X-Files, including supporting characters like the Lone Gunman, including supporting characters like Skinner or the cigarette-smoking man, they don't have that delineation. You can have cigarette-smoking man show up in F Emasculata, for example. You can have the Lone Gunman show up in Blood, for example. You can have Skinner pop up in, say, Avatar. But even just standalone adventures along the way, like Pusher. And they become part of the world and the texture of the X-Files. Beyond, this is a special episode, so it stars this character. Spender never gets that. Spender never gets a moment in the limelight. He never gets to be seen outside the context of this grand mythology stuff. And again, this is one of the things where I'm wary of it being like, oh, well, you know, I obviously know how to fix this problem, and I've thought a great deal about it, and Darren's fanfiction corner. But I always thought that it was a massive missed opportunity in the first half of the sixth season not to do a Spender-centric episode. Because I know that, like, Anderson and Duchovny were worked to the bone. I know they would have appreciated a light week, like the show had done in the past by giving, say, Skinner episodes that kind of centered around him, by letting Mitch Pileggi carry the show for a week. And I feel like if you had done something like that with Spender, if you had given Spender an episode where he was, I don't know, forced to investigate an X-file due to some bureaucratic loophole, and it doesn't even have to be a mythology or conspiracy episode, although you could probably do something like SR819 with Spender instead. And that would mean coming into this episode, you would have a better sense of who he is and why you should care about him at all. Here, and again, this is the thing where you just have that exposition where Skinner just shows up. And by the way, it's a bit of a dick move. Skinner's like about to tell him that his mother who disappeared has suddenly reappeared and is back from the dead. But the first thing Skinner does is bust his fucking balls. Skinner's like, I want you to know I'm not proud of you, son. I'm very disappointed in you. Your mother's alive, but I am disappointed in you. And again, that feels like something that would make more sense if we had had any other Skinner scene. Because again, you mentioned those scenes like Mulder, like the scene with Mulder in the end, or in Requiem, for example, or even Biogenesis, where Skinner pops up and he's like, have you thought about what you're going to do after this? Because that's an important theme of the adventure you're about to have, Mulder. Yeah. At least those feel like they build on the idea of Skinner as like stern father figure to Mulder, who like wants Mulder to do well and is constantly disappointed when Mulder somehow manages to be a pain in his backside. It doesn't feel like he has that relationship with Spender. It doesn't feel like Spender has like engaged with him in any substantive way outside of, you know, some small stuff in maybe the end. So it doesn't feel earned is a problem. And that's a problem with the two-parter, I contend.
They're on screen briefly together in Triangle, aren't they? Spender and Skinner. But that's kind of a hard episode to get invested in Spender through, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so strange, yeah. Okay, so Cassandra's back. She's alive. And she wants to speak to Agent Mulder. Let's skip to where, you know, Mulder and Scully enter actually quite late in this episode. It's almost about 10 minutes in before we get Mulder and Scully. You know, it's that basketball scene. Yo, homestyle, cough up the rock.
And his J.O.B.
Yeah. The jag-off shoeshine tip or whatever it was. Just a nugget off the commentary. The basketball scene was supposed to be a rooftop court, which I think would have made a nice change given how we've said there were a lot of interiors.
Yeah, it would have been nice outdoors. Like, there is a sky and it is beautiful.
Yeah. But in the end, they went indoors, and apparently the noise of the floor meant all the dialogue had to be looped afterwards, according to Kim Manners. Okay, so there are X-Files episodes where Mulder and Scully are in a more passive role, but for like a big mythology installment such as this, it seems more of an issue to me. That's kind of what you feel as well, or not?
No, I mean, I wouldn't go quite that far. I think the issue for me with Two Fathers, One Son is almost that, like, it's pick a lane, basically. It's like, you can do this story from Mulder and Scully's perspective, or you can do it from the Syndicate's perspective and treat Mulder and Scully as outsiders. And the show seems to kind of opt for a half and half approach. So you spend a lot of time with like Spender as he gets deeper into the Syndicate, hanging out with Krychek, being sent to assassinate kind of the replacement, rebel figure in there. You get a lot of time with the doctors and the cigarette smoking man, but you keep cutting back to Mulder and Scully, who are not doing anything particularly relevant to the plot. And indeed, like the entire point of, not to jump too far ahead to One Son, but like One Son hinges on Mulder and Scully arriving to the scene of the crime both far too late and also entirely off screen, which feels like it's like you could do that, but if you're going to do that, then you don't spend as much time with Mulder and Scully in the rest of the episode, because their storyline and their thread doesn't go anywhere substantive. It doesn't have any big dramatic payoff. I think there are small moments, particularly in One Son, that work very well for Mulder and work very well for Scully, but their arc over the two-parter isn't clear. And it's like obvious when you compare it to something like, say, The Red and the Black, and Patient X, where like Scully has a very clear journey in that, from one end of the episode to the other, and where she ends is fundamentally different from where she starts. In Two Fathers, One Son, there's a constant sense of, we need to find something for Mulder and Scully to do while the story that we're actually telling is happening. And it's notable in that sense that, again, not to jump into One Son discussion too early, but Diana Fowley is introduced in the closing moments of Two Fathers and only becomes an active concern in One Son. As in, like, her interactions with Mulder and through Mulder with Scully only become a plot thread in the second half of this two-parter, and it feels like that only happens because the writer said, we need something for Mulder and Scully to do while this plot is unfolding. It all feels like wheel spinning. And I mean, I'm not as kind of, I don't feel as strongly as you that Mulder and Scully have to have something to do. I think it might be interesting to just have them show up at the end and find the burnt bodies and have no idea what happened. And for us as audience members to actually see all the stuff that led to it. But I also, think it's possible to do a story that is told from their perspective. I think Two Fathers, One Son tries to satisfy two masters, and it doesn't satisfy either, is the problem. That's my big problem with the episode. It doesn't choose the story that it wants to tell. It tries to have the best of both worlds, and it doesn't work. It ends up undermining both.
I think that where One Son is going, where Mulder, he has this period of weakness where he basically gives up, and Scully kind of snaps him out of it with a call to action. I think that's all, has potential. I think the way it's executed is kind of muddled, But we'll come to that. We'll come to what they get up to for the subsequent two-parter. There's a nice scene between the Smoking Man and Openshaw. I think it's very nicely played. There's a glance from the Smoking Man when Openshaw says that Cassandra will be hard to divert attention from, which I really like. It seems like Chris Carter channeling himself through Openshaw. A man should never live long enough to see his children or his work destroyed. So there's a bit of foreshadowing. I like this because Smoking Man often seems like the callous one in this kind of scene. I think it might be Apocrypha, where it's, or Piper Maru, I can't remember which one, where he's like, remove the body of the guy who's still living. But here, Openshaw's the sinister one, and he's quite resigned to his fate. And I thought it was a nice little exchange.
And it is, and again, this is the thing where you get the sense of the episode, like Two Fathers, One Son, working best for characters who aren't Mulder and Scully. Because between Two Fathers and One Son, you have a nice mirroring arc for the cigarette-smoking man. Where here, with Openshaw is like, they're going to come and question me. You need to kill me. He doesn't actually say you need to kill me, but that's the subtext of it. And the cigarette-smoking man gets this rare moment of humanity for him, where he's like, I kind of regret it, but I'll do it. And you get that mirrored in One Son, where Cassandra's like, okay, you need to kill me to save humanity. And the cigarette-smoking man is like, no, I can't do that. I actually maybe have feelings for you. I maybe care for another human being. And that love renders me incapable of killing you. And I think that contrast and that parallel, that structural element is clever between the two-parter. And it feels much more focused than anything you get with Mulder and Scully. It feels like it's setting up an idea and paying off an idea. And it's kind of like when I say that I feel like the story might work better without Mulder and Scully, it's that sort of stuff, where it feels like the cigarette-smoking man gets a little journey across the two-parter, where you get the mirroring of scenes between the two parts that makes sense and that works. And there's nothing like that involving Mulder and Scully. Scully. There's not really much in Two Fathers for Mulder that's mirrored in One Son, or for Scully in Two Fathers that's mirrored in One Son. It's just like, no, they get a bunch of stuff to do and they're on screen and there's a scene with them every once in a while to remind you that their names are in the credits. It's very strange.
There's basketball scenes in both episodes, isn't there? That element is mirrored.
To bring it all together. I like that.
Yeah.
Bouncing ideas off it.
Well, it's always nice to see Duchovny, with his athletic prowess. If you've got it, flaunt it.
Yeah.
Cassandra Spender I wanted to talk a bit about. So, there's all the stuff at the hospital where Scully brings her to Mulder and so on. There's an allusion back to the skeptical Mulder arc of season 5. She mentions his sister. I think one of the main points is that Cassandra has had this kind of about face, hasn't she, since the last time we saw her in the 5th season, about what she believes the aliens are up to and so on. Now,
but that happens entirely off screen. Like that's the problem with it.
This is the thing.
Yeah. Like that's a huge character moment, and it should be a huge moment between Cassandra and Mulder, where not only have their two positions kind of flipped in that, like, obviously Mulder is now a believer again, but also Cassandra, who had been this evangelical figure about how the aliens are going to save us, is now like, oh no, they're going to brutally murder all of us and turn us into a slave race. That's not something that should happen off screen. That's not like a character development, that you can just kind of shunt and say, well, things are different now, so guess we better pick up where we went off. And like, that's the problem with the episode, where it feels so bitty, where it feels very much like, and Cassandra in particular is a problem because she's like an exposition delivery machine, where she's like, there's a line where she says, when Mulder asks, what are they here for? And Cassandra's like, to wipe us off the planet. They're taking over the universe. They're infecting all of their life forms with a black substance called purity. And it's like, that's not how characters have traditionally explained how these things work in the X-Files. And like, that was a good thing. It was a good thing that they didn't talk like this. This is just a bullet point summary of, like those lobby cards they used to give out when people went to see Dune to explain what's going on. It's really frustrating.
It's frustrating, but the reason I can get past it as much as I can is because I think Veronica Cartwright's a seasoned professional, and she delivers it very well, I think.
Yes.
And of course, she knows one of them's my ex-husband, so we get all that stuff as well, which is kind of funny. The Syndicate. Okay, so the Syndicate in this episode. So Krychek's slideshow at one point. It's interesting, this thing with a spy in the camp, isn't it? With the faceless rebel who's taken over George Murdoch's character, the second elder. That's kind of fun. Again, there's a lot of info dumping in that stuff, Krychek. But it's fun to see CSM thinking as Krychek's unloading to the second elder. It's fun to see Krychek kind of look down when the CSM's bigging up Spender as his man in the FBI and all of that. The intimations you get here and there through the two-parter of Krychek wanting to be the heir.
Yeah.
Heir to the throne is interesting. Apparently there's a deleted scene which plays it up further. But it's maybe not foregrounded as much as it could have been.
Well, that's it. Like, there's a lot of stuff here. And again, this is why I kind of like, when I come back to Mulder and Scully having too much to do in the episode almost, is because it feels like it crams all of this stuff in far, far, far too tightly. Like, the second elder, the rebel replacing the second elder, shows up for one scene, blows his cover, and then gets brutally murdered. There's no suspense. There's no tension. No. It's quite literally like, this is what happened. And the same thing as we point out with Krychek, where, the fact that he might want to replace the cigarette smoking man is kind of intimated, but it's never really developed. And the way in which, there's a lot of inelegant plotting here, like the way in which Spender finds out that the cigarette smoking man is responsible for what happened to his mother. And like the way in which Krychek just drops that information, where Krychek, who is one of the most canny and wily and like manipulative characters on the show, like delivers this thing where he's like, oh, your father's a great man who's made horrible sacrifices. And he's like, what sacrifices? Oh, your mother. He sacrificed your mother. And like, you're watching that, and the first time I watched it, I was like, oh, Krychek is setting Spender against CSM in order to, like, obviously to turn them against each other so he can move into a position of power, whether because he wants to impress CSM or replace CSM or replace Spender. But the way in which the scene plays, it becomes clear, oh no, oops, Krychek forgot that he wasn't supposed to mention that CSM had been experimenting on Spender's mother. Boy, he really put his foot in his mouth there. Which again, it's not organic plotting. It's very much like, well, we need to get the plot from A to B to C. We need to get to, Jeffrey Spender confronting his father. How do we do that? We have Krychek accidentally reveal that CSM isn't actually a good guy underneath it all. And it's so inelegant. And the weird stuff is that, like, if you put all this stuff out and you take a glimpse at it from a distance, there's a lot of really, really great stuff there. Like, you could make a really good two-parter from the constituent elements here, but you need to give them room to breathe. Like, I would love to see Spender spending more time getting involved in the syndicate and, like, trying to impress Dad. I'd like to see more of Krychek and Spender hanging out together, where Krychek is both kind of taking Spender under his wing, but also being obviously resentful of the fact that somebody who is far, far less talented than him, and let's face it, Krychek is only somewhat talented when it comes to this sort of stuff based on past experience, but, like, resentful of, like, the opportunity that's being given to him. I'd love to see more of the second elder infiltrating the group and being revealed or being undermined, and the reaction of the other elders to this, because, like, CSM just orders him murdered. Like, if your best buddy ends up dead and turns out to be a shape-shifting alien, surely you're going to want to know who knew what when he was replaced, and who signed off on that. Can the cigarette-smoking man sign off on this? And also, if the cigarette-smoking man turned out to be wrong, if the second elder had just suddenly had a change of heart and the dead body lying on the floor didn't disintegrate into a pool of acid, what was going to happen then? I mean, like, there's all this kind of fun stuff to pick at and to think about, and, like, I think that's one of the things that I find, like, a missed opportunity with Two Fathers, One Son, is that, like, and particularly Two Fathers, is that at times this almost feels like a day in the life of the Syndicate. It almost feels like you're actually getting, because the show is, like, and understandably clouded these characters in mystery for so long. How they operate on a day-to-day basis has been kept, like, abstract. How they do what they do, how they reach where they reach. We often enter scenes after they've been there, or we see the impact of their handiwork, if not the handiwork itself. Or we see, like, the low-level decision, like the person taking the shot after everything else has been arranged. What we don't see is the actual day-to-day organizing and running of it. And there are elements of Two Fathers that really feel like they're almost getting at that. Like, I would love to just spend a day with, like, Krychek and Spender doing, like, training day, but for the conspiracy and the X-Files. and it feels like a missed opportunity.
It would have been fun, because I've always thought that moment in Redux 2 where Smoking Man's like, quit the FBI, come work for me. I love that Mulder refuses, but I've always been intrigued, like, what would that actually be like? So I can see a lot of potential there. But one of the elements kind of jockeying for screen time, of course, is Mulder and Scully being processed out of the FBI, where
for like 10 minutes.
This is the thing, it feels very rote, and it's curious because although we see Kirsch at the very end of One Son, a lot of the early part of season 6 seems to be about establishing Kirsch as this big threat, you know, this person they need to be really careful of. So his absence in this two-parter, especially given that they're supposed to be suspended, possibly out of a job, seems a bit of a bit regrettable to me. Not least, you know, also the fact that we've seen, you know, Mulder and Scully on the outs with the FBI in the past, and, you know.
And again, like, at this point, they're getting suspended almost every other week, it seems. Like, again, Mulder just didn't show up to work at the start of this episode. So, I mean, it's not that much of a big deal. Like, again, it very much feels like it's, you know, when you watch classic Doctor Who, for example, where they have to stretch out a plot to reach 6 episodes, there's a lot of, like, characters being captured and escaping, or running up and down the same corridor set over and over. And when you watch Two Fathers, it often feels like it's that for Mulder and Scully. It's like, well, we need to do something with them, but what we're doing with them can't be too complicated because it will distract from the story we're telling. So let's just have them, I don't know, put on administrative leave again, drummed out, suspended. Yeah, sure, that's worked a couple of times. People know how that story beat works. You know, there'll be no consequences or repercussions down the line whatsoever. And in fact, they'll actually end the two-parter in a much stronger position than they started it. But sure, why not? Let's just go with it. That's kind of, that frustrates me. Is like, that's something that really upsets me about the two-parter, is that it feels like either use Mulder and Scully or don't. Pick a lane. Do, you know, like, choose. Decide what you're going to do with them. Don't have them there because you feel like they have to be there, and then generate story material that takes time and attention away from the actual important stuff that's happening in the two-parter, I think. Yeah,
I think I was wrong there. I think it's this episode, isn't it, where we get the second basketball scene, because it comes after that. It's when Scully's done the research again off screen about who the Smoking Man was, CGP Spender, and the photograph of the father and all of that. So The upshot, I think, is that the project is still going on, which Mulder says.
By the way, I love the reveal that it's CJB Spender is such a great non-reveal, because it is nominally his name, but Slay's also oh, by the way, it's just an alias. So it's so it's not actually his name. It doesn't actually reveal anything. It just sounds like a detail. It's that thing that we kind of talked about at the start of the episode. We'll probably talk more about when we get to One Son, but it's the illusion of change. It gives you the sense that there has been some momentum, but what it ultimately is just an empty box. It's another mystery box inside. Because the way it's structured, Carter could change his mind later on and reveal that actually the cigarette smoking man's real name was Melvin Mulder.
Yeah.
CJB Spender was just an alias that he used. It's very much kind of like watching a shell game, but not done particularly well.
It is. It's only a couple of minutes where it's left there that you think it's the character's name before Scully comes in and talks about the aliases, isn't it? Yeah. The cigarette smoking man seems quite optimistic to me, putting his eggs in Spender's basket. But we get that whole thing of, giving Spender the stiletto and he's going to take out the faceless rebel. I think you're right. I think it's a sequence that promises a lot. You're right, it doesn't generate much suspense. It seems kind of modelled on the sequence in The Godfather, doesn't it, where Michael Corleone has to go and kill the police chief and Sollozzo.
Yeah.
But that scene is masterful and it draws it out. And this scene, it's
I love Spender's oops, dropped it. Now I'm going to clumsily present this to you before I attempt to stab you in the back of the neck. And I just want to stress here, I know Spender is not good at what he's doing. Spender is for Spender, it's like spending Frito to to that meeting. It's basically the equivalent of what the cigarette smoking man's done. But to Spender's credit, we've seen in the past that even people who know how to use a stiletto have difficulty getting the right spot on the back of an alien's neck. Is it Herrenvolk just basically has a reveal where the bounty hunter gets up because it ended up in the wrong part of the back of his neck? So part of me is wondering, what are you doing here? Why would you send Spender without having him do a trial run at least first? This seems like it's a very unfortunate miscalculation, particularly given that if he gets it wrong, the alien's going to presumably bleed toxic blood that will kill him anyway.
Yeah. I think, does this make Alex Krycek? He's the kind of Robert Duvall character in this analogy, because he's not...
Officially part of the family, not really been adopted.
Yeah.
And again,
you're not a wartime consigliere, Alex.
Which I suppose makes sense based on past performance, to be fair.
I think one of the things I felt watching this episode again last night, and maybe not so much with One Son, is that it's quite static. A lot of these scenes are quite static with the conversation. So when Skinner turns up at Mulder's apartment and he gets the lowdown on the alien-human hybrid plan, there's not much going on. They just talk at each other. There's not much movement in the frame, and it seems to be that kind of thing for quite a few of these exposition dumps. I don't know if you felt the same.
Oh no, absolutely. That's the problem, is that it's very much exposition and dialogue driven, which is a shame because, for all that we talk about the conspiracy and the mythology and the idea of this overarching plot, if you break it down, the mythology episodes up until this point were largely sweeps episodes, and those sweeps episodes meant that they were blockbuster episodes. So Nicey in 731, sure, it reveals a lot about experimentation on a train and about the idea that there's this rival Japanese conspiracy to mirror the American one that we're looking at right now. But it's also Mulder on a train car with an assassin. It's really tense, it's really exciting, it's really riveting, and it's really high concept. And again, you could drop somebody into Nicey in 731, and maybe they'd be a little bit disoriented at first, but those episodes are constructed so that there's enough dynamic movement that you're always oh, that's why Mulder wants to get on the train. That's why Mulder's in trouble. There's a bomb on the train, and that bomb is giving us, again, that Hitchcockian idea of, the difference between a twist and suspense. It's you have a ticking clock, so now you have stakes. With Two Fathers and One Son, all that stuff is entirely abstract. In that, you have people, as you pointed out, just talking to one another. We're told that, this is very tense. We're told that there's, a ticking clock. We're told that the time is near. That with the discovery of Cassandra, there's a sense that all this house of cards is coming tumbling down. But it's, to pick an example from the two-parter that's most obviously comparable to, which is, The Red and the Black and Patient X from back in the 5th season. At least then you have, the idea of the rebel crash landing. and that creating a ticking clock for the conspirators and the vaccine. Because if the well-manicured man can demonstrate that the vaccine works while they have the rebel in custody, they can maybe change the terms of the deal. But if one of those two elements doesn't work, or one of them works after the other one, then it doesn't matter and all is lost. With Two Fathers, One Son, there's no sense of that. There's always a sense of this threat will last precisely as long as it takes these characters to explain the nature of the threat in excruciating detail to one another and to the audience. It's very strange. It's very strange.
It is. I can tell you Kurt North's favourite moment of this episode is when Diana Fowley turns up. He loves Diana Fowley. Just a brief appearance. I mean, you were talking about Spender as a character who was never developed sufficiently. And I know that Fowley hangs around a bit after this two-parter. But the same for her, really, and probably more so than Spender, because she doesn't even get the cameo appearances in things like Triangle or Terms of Endearment, does she?
And she's also, like, at least Spender is an interesting archetype in the context of the show in being the bad son. I mean, you have the cigarette smoking man slapping him at one point and saying, "You're no Fox Mulder, damn it." But like, I mean, at least that's an interesting archetype to have in the context of the show. With Fowley, she was always weighted with this frankly terrible, like, the other woman cliche. She was always the Jezebel. She was always the character who was designed to be hated by the audience, because she was trying to seduce Mulder away from Scully. Now, obviously, Spender, to a certain extent, is designed to be hated because he's the character who comes in and takes over the X-Files. But he at least is introduced with a sympathetic backstory in that you understand that the loss of his mother made him the way that he is. You understand that he believes what he believes because he had a childhood that was traumatic as a result of what happened to his mother. So you have a built-in amount of sympathy even when he acts like a jerk or an asshole. And like, even here in like Two Fathers, One Son, where he is just the worst. He is the Frito character. Like, at least you get with like Frito in The Godfather, you get that sense of like patheticness. You get that sense of like, Frito's like, "I was the number one son. I should have been treated with respect, Michael." And there's a real sense of that with Spender, where it's like, I want my dad to respect me and I want to know what's happening to my mother. And even though I am grossly incompetent at what I'm doing, I just wish the people around me treated me a little bit better. At least that is something that inspires a vague degree of sympathy and empathy and compassion. Whereas with Fowley, it's quite literally like, no. She's trying to sleep with Mulder, and we know that we don't want that to happen because either we want Mulder to sleep with Scully, or we don't want anybody to sleep with anybody. No matter what the outcome, nobody is rooting for like Mulder and Fowley to get together. And that is her sole defining attribute as a character. And I mean, like, it's very telling that, you suggested that possibly one of the things that they took out of Two Fathers, based on Kim Manners' commentary, was that extended flashback subplot. And they just slotted this in instead. And I think that you can probably see that, because I think that One Son tries to generate some suspense about Fowley's like allegiances and alliances and where she falls in terms of like the idea of good and evil on the show's spectrum. Whereas this subplot in Two Fathers, in case there's any ambiguity, makes it very clear. No, she's evil through and through, just in case you're wondering. But it really does feel like she's used here as just this vacant, empty space. It's like, we need the cigarette smoking man to exposit to somebody. And based on what we find out about Fowley and One Son, in particular, say, what she's been doing in Europe throughout the show's like history, you assume that she has to know most of this, or at least some of this already from context. But we know so little about her and her motivations and who she is as a character. You can just dump her in and have the cigarette smoking man monologue at her for the bones of 45 minutes. And that is as productive a use as the character has had to this point in the show, which is, again, very unfair to Mimi Rogers, who can be great when she's given the material. But here, she is not. And I feel bad that I hate Fowley as much as I do, because, anyway, it's a lot.
Sorry, Kurt, if you're listening. Didn't know he was going to launch into that.
But I mean, Mimi Rogers is great. I will give Mimi Rogers that. And I think that, there's possibly some interesting stuff you can do. I think she's probably actually a little bit more interesting after this is done. After this, I think that her arc in, say, I really like the three-parter that bridges the 6th and 7th seasons. I think that maybe there's some material for her there.
Yeah.
But here, no. No.
No, there's not much. I mean, she does touch the smoking man as she gets up, doesn't she? It's interesting. I do wonder exactly what was going on between those two.
Oh, and the cigarette smoking man shows up in her
Yep.
bedroom later on as well, in case you got any subtext there. Yeah,
Yep.
and in case, the whole thing wasn't kind of vaguely Oedipal enough, you have the possibility that, like, Mulder and... Is it his father? Is it not his father? The cigarette smoking man might have an attraction to the same woman.
Yeah. Spotnitz describes Foley as the evil rival for Dana Scully on the commentary, which is quite blatant and blunt, what he says.
But like on Spotnitz's commentary, though, he also says there's a point where it's like, in case you didn't know in case you're wondering what side she was on, this is the moment where you know that she's evil, and it's the moment when she kisses Mulder. It's not the moment when she aligns with the cigarette smoking man. It's not the moment when the cigarette smoking man shows up in her apartment unaided. It's the moment where her lips touch Mulder's lips. It's like, yeah, this woman is evil, and the show wants to communicate to us because she's going to get in the way of Mulder and Scully. And it's such an awful cliche. It's the other woman. And she's denied any agency or any character or any development. Like, she's not even given the stuff that Spender is. And we talked about how Spender is underserved. Foley is somewhat even more underserved, which is a shame, because, like, there's something very interesting in that idea of, I would love to have seen Foley's arc where she goes from being a believer like Mulder to becoming somebody who sold her soul to the devil. I would love to see that story where Foley, after having worked with Mulder for so long on the X-Files, having discovered them together, and presumably having invested in them as a true believer, what did she see that changed her mind? What did she see that made her go, no, I'm in wholeheartedly? Because it's been heavily implied that it's not just this conversation. Because obviously she was visiting MUFON beforehand, and obviously, like, her actions in the beginning, for example, are very explicitly, this woman's not to be trusted. I would love to, like, that's the story I want from Foley. I want the story, I want the temptation, I want the kind of the why you sign yourself over to this. And it's something that the show does repeatedly. It does it again, later on in the 11th season, with kind of,
Reyes.
with Reyes, where Reyes has this moment. And it's played offhand, and it's not a big deal, and it's never treated as anything that has any interiority for the character. It's just, she's Judas. She's a traitor to Mulder and Scully, and that's all that you need to know about her. And that's the stuff that I think would be interesting, and the show never really does it convincingly. Arguably the only time it even attempts it is with Skinner, and with Skinner always chooses the right side. Skinner always ends up on the right side of that line. So there's no real... I'd love to see a story where a character ends up on the wrong side, basically. And it feels like, so many missed opportunities when we talk about Two Fathers, One Son.
Just to wrap up on Two Fathers, really. So as the episode gets towards its close, so Mark Snow's music gets a bit more urgent at the hospital. I didn't feel like there was any real tension myself, but Cassandra's gone. And then she turns up at Mulder's agitated, asking to be killed. And the ending is that Mulder draws his gun. So, like we've said, they've kind of been peripheral, Mulder and Scully. This seems like a feint, at least, at an attempt at making them a bit more active. Kim Manners on the commentary says the final scene needed a lot of work to make believable on an emotional level. It was a real fine line we were walking here, I believe is what he said. How well did they walk that line with the cliffhanger?
I mean, do you ever believe that Mulder is going to shoot an unarmed woman in his apartment? And I mean, like, whatever about the cliffhanger to Gethsemane, and I would argue, like, the cliffhanger to Gethsemane isn't even, oh my god, Mulder killed himself, because if you're a televisually literate viewer, you know the X-Files is coming back next season, you know Duchovny is filming a movie in the middle of summer. The tension with that cliffhanger isn't, oh my god, Mulder killed himself, it's, oh my god, how are the writers going to get out of this ending where it appeared that Mulder killed himself? And then watching that unfold. Somewhat inelegantly, if we're going to be entirely frank about the opening scenes of Redux 1, but such is life. And I think that with Two Fathers, like, the scope and the scale of this story are absolutely massive on a theoretical level. This is, as you pointed out, a story that is potentially about an alien invasion. It's about watching colonization, which is something that has been implicitly part of the show since at least Colony and Endgame, and explicitly since Talitha Kumi, which is the first time that it's mentioned that this is the endgame that the aliens have in mind. This should be a big deal, and you look at it, and nobody watching that show believes Mulder's going to kill Cassandra. Nobody believes that Mulder's going to pull that trigger. And so there's no tension there. It just feels like they got to the midpoint of the two-parter and they're like, we need a scene to break on. I guess this is it. And again, like, compare it to the ending of Patient X, where you have that scene at the bridge and you have the screams and the cut to black. That's an effective cliffhanger ending. This is not. And again, this is something that feels kind of interesting because, as I mentioned, the advertisements in the press sold this as 5 years of question, 2 nights of answers. And it very much feels like Two Fathers, One Son is almost intended to be seen as a block. It's not really 2 separate episodes. You're meant to watch them. If you're in for Two Fathers, you might as well come back for One Son. And it feels like it doesn't really work that way. It doesn't have that kind of... They're aiming for a smoothness of transition between the 2 episodes the scripts don't support because they are very different episodes. So you need a strong cliffhanger between them because you're going to want to pivot sharply. Particularly given, like, I would argue you should probably have had the cliffhanger of Two Fathers be something equivalent to the opening moments of One Son. Like, if you'd moved, say, the opening 2 minutes in Mulder's apartment in One Son to the end of Two Fathers, you'd have a stronger episode. The moment where the CDC come in, and the moment where Foley reveals herself wearing the mask. And I love that she's wearing her earrings in the mask. That's a lovely little touch that I adore. But, like, I feel like that's ending on that scene, having Cassandra taken away, having Foley wearing that CDC costume, having Mulder and Scully, like, locked in the apartment and air sealed in the apartment, is a much more convincing and honest cliffhanger than, is Mulder going to shoot this lovely Emmy-nominated character? Which I don't think anybody is ever going to believe will happen.
No, I think that's a good point, but we're in danger of segueing straight into One Son here.
Sorry.
So, till we reconvene next week, Darren, did you just want to let people know where you are online and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, perfect. You can find me online at Darren_Mooney. I run a podcast with my good friend Andrew Quinn called The 250. We were very lucky to have Carl on recently talking about Hugo, and also we ran an episode of the Movie Palace talking about The Aviator as well as part of our Summer of Scorsese. So yes, if you want to listen to our episodes coming up, we will be discussing for Chinese New Year and for Valentine's Day, we'll be talking about In the Mood for Love with the fantastic Stacey Growden and the wonderful Luke Dunn on the podcast there. In terms of myself, I write at The Escapist, so I do 2 columns there every week in The Frame, and I also do YouTube content for them, including movie reviews and features and commentaries there, so you can find me online there. Please feel free to pop over and give a subscription or even just watch those reviews there if you want, if you have spare time, and if you like using YouTube.
Yeah, perfect. Cheers, Darren.
Cheers.
Looking forward to next week already. You can find the Xcast in all the usual places, listeners, at the X_cast on Twitter, Xcast Basement on Facebook, also on Instagram. That's all for today, and until next time, always remember, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Cerebral Jukebox.
I think as I've got older, I don't care what people think of my music taste anymore. I'm happy to admit that, like, I really missed the boat because, like, in the 2000s I was really angsty teen and I was Papa Roach and Linkin Park on the daily, and I'd be ashamed to admit that I kind of like Savage Garden and Craig David, and I had this very strange diet. But now I go back and listen to all these like 2000s UK garage tracks and they were absolutely astounding.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
Maybe I'm not coming at it from an educated point of view because, you know, not only am I a man, I'm gay. You know, I don't deal with pregnancy.
Are you?
And
have you ever told us that before?
I was trying to make a serious point.
Hey, we love you know that.
Yeah. But yeah, you've got a good point, Colin. This is a bit of a sausage fest episode. Maybe we should have got a lady involved.
The Movie Palace.
This is a film you'd seen before we decided to discuss these two. Is that right? This was a rewatch for you?
No, this was a first-time viewing. Bells of St. Mary's, I watched for the first time last Christmas and really enjoyed it. And I had heard many things about the first one, especially how it had, swept at the Oscars, but I had never watched it. So when we started to discuss, a film to talk about for the holidays, I thought this is a great excuse to watch the first one.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.